Thanks very much, everyone, for coming. I'm Steve Grundman. I'm a senior fellow here in the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security at the Atlantic Council. I appreciate you coming here today. The purposes of this event is to hear an address from Ellen Lord, the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment. She has entitled her address 5G Networks, the Acquisition Path Forward. Following her prepared remarks, she's agreed to join me in these armchairs where she and I will have a conversation, and then we'll leave 20 or 15 minutes at the end of the 75 minutes that we're going to talk to take questions from those of you here in the audience, and I welcome that. This event comes against the backdrop of attention the Trump administration and many others have been giving to the deployment of 5G networks and how both our strategic competitors as well as our close allies, respectively, are responding to the advent of this game-changing technology. Among the others giving concerted attention to the matter is no less than the Council's Executive Chairman Emeritus, General Jim Jones. And presently, I will ask him to take the podium to set the stage for our discussion and to introduce Ms. Lord. However, before we move to that substance, I am obliged to render a few administrative notes, if I may. First, the event is on the record. Moreover, we are live streaming this event over our website. This, of course, has most significance for Ms. Lord, but for the rest of you, if I should call upon you to offer a question during that portion of the hour and 15 minutes, please wait for one of our staff to bring you the microphone and clearly identify yourself and your affiliation before asking your question. Second, we are tweeting, or I'm told to say live tweeting, as if there were any other kind, the event at the hashtag ACDefense, and we could even receive a good question over Twitter. So for those of you watching the stream, if you'd like to get a question in the queue, you can do that at hashtag ACDefense. Third, if I recognize you to ask a question, please ask one question and come to your point promptly. I was at an event last week, and I think the first three people who asked questions started by saying, I have two questions. So there will be plenty of questions, but not enough time to take them all. I'd appreciate if you would confine yourself to one good question when I respond to your hand. Thank you. Finally, I'm going to sound like a schoolmarm here, but we need to end at 6:20, perhaps. We could run out to 6:20. So I'll appreciate your help in pacing us all to that deadline as it approaches when you ask your questions. Thank you. This event, today's event, is the 15th in the Atlantic Council's Defense Industrial Policy Series, which I produce. I'm quite pleased and proud of it. It's an initiative to make a preeminent platform available to public officials and others who can address government's stewardship of defense industrial resources. Previous speakers in this series include the acquisition executives of all three of the U.S. military departments, as well as the U.S. Special Operations Command, Secretary of the Air Force Deborah James, and last year Secretary of the Army Mark Esper. This series is a cousin of another series I produce called Captains of Industry. Indeed, that platform is one from which Ms. Lord spoke in January of 2014 when she was Chief Executive of Textron Systems. So I want to thank you, Ellen, for adding your now still more distinguished name to the distinguished roster of alumni of this series, the Defense Industrial Policy Series. Thank you very much. All right, now let me welcome to the podium General Jones. I'm sure that for most of you here in the audience today, I need only remind you that his public service is nearly without equal for its importance in the range of national security roles that he has played. National Security Advisor to President Obama, Supreme Allied Commander Europe, and Commander of the U.S. European Command, 32nd Commandant of the U.S. Marine Corps, of course. However, having said those things, it being March and my sharing with him an association with Georgetown University, I feel compelled to make at least a small mention, a brief mention of something that is maybe unknown to most of you, but for those of us Hoyas, maybe a still more distinguished association. And that is General Jones he was a forward on the famous 1963-1964 Georgetown Hoyas basketball team. Why were they famous, you may ask? Well, because on a dark winter night in December 1963, they went up to Philadelphia and defeated the reigning national champion and then ranked #1 Loyola of Chicago. So forward General and later General James Jones. All I can say is that as a Hoya, after that, all these other accomplishments were just cream. So I do welcome him and appreciate him coming. Please join me in welcoming him. You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Since this is March Madness, let me talk about that game for a little while. I wish I'd gotten into it, by the way, but I watched it very closely from the bench. Steve, thank you very much for the introduction and your stewardship of this series. It really is a fantastic operation you've got going here. The Defense Industrial Policy Series is a good example of programming that befits the Center's namesake, General Brent Scowcroft. Like Brent, the series highlights voices that can articulate strategic issues that require hard thinking and practical action. Today's speaker and the topic are no exception. We're privileged to have with us the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment, Ellen Lord, who's going to give us an address entitled 5G Networks, the Acquisition Path Forward. Before introducing Ellen and inviting her to the podium, I'd like to underscore the importance of this topic and describe its strategic context in this era of great power competition. 5G, or fifth generation wireless technology, enables the transmission of data at speeds 100 times faster than the 4G networks we use today, 100 times faster. It is a classic disruptive technology which will revolutionize how those with secure access to it live, work, move, communicate, and make decisions. It will become the bedrock of the digital infrastructure for the 21st century. In my mind, the race is to develop secure 5G infrastructure is no less important than the race to put a man on the moon or to complete the Manhattan Project of the 1940s. Put another way, it's a Sputnik moment in terms of its effect, only this time instead of the Soviet Union, it could be another country that gets there first. 5G infrastructure is strategic because it's shaping and will shape entire economies and societies, and it will be a lever for national and international power. It's also strategic because it holds a particular importance for national security and the protection of intellectual property. Those who establish and control this digital infrastructure will be able to capture and exploit the vast information, public and private, running through it. Because of the strategic importance of 5G and its profound implications on national security and interoperability, we should talk not just about 5G, but also, and maybe more importantly, about secure 5G. Many countries are fully aware of the full commercial and strategic importance of 5G, and the Chinese government in particular, in its subsidies of the development of 5G networks, and through its national champion, a company that we read about called Huawei, is aggressively pursuing the establishment of a digital infrastructure around the globe using its 5G system. And we should recognize up front that they're doing it quite well and quite convincingly. But I believe that the Chinese campaign warrants an urgent and robust public and private sector response from the United States. And we're fortunate that Ms. Lord is here this afternoon to discuss what she and DoD are doing in that regard. I'm doubly pleased to introduce Secretary Lord, not only because of her grasp on the issue, but also because it gives me the opportunity publicly to express my appreciation for her engagement with the Atlantic Council over many years. We thank you for that. I'm told that she would like me to say a little more by way of introducing her than she is an American businesswoman who was appointed Under Secretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment in August of 2017, and before which she was the Chief Executive Officer of Textron Systems, a company where she had served for more than 30 years. However, for those of you who don't already know the Undersecretary, I'd like to add 2 points to her resume. First, her recent appointment to public office has sprung from a substantial record of her interest in public affairs and service to public interest institutions. I've already mentioned her importance to us as a constituent of the Atlantic Council, when she was at Textron. She's also served as vice chairman of the National Defense Industrial Association on the board of trustees at the United States Naval Institute Foundation. Secondly and finally, I want to affirm that Secretary Lord has exactly the kind of Scowcroft qualities which the many strategic quandaries of her job require: a hard-thinking temperament combined with a bias for practical action. Please join me in welcoming Under Secretary Ellen Lord to the podium.
So thank you, General Jones. Thank you, Steve, and thank you to the Atlantic Council for inviting me here this evening. One of the things that happens when you work in the Pentagon sometimes is you don't come out nearly often enough. So it's wonderful to be out and be able to converse with you all about a very, very important topic for us, 5G. My job, I believe, as Undersecretary for Acquisition and Sustainment is to fundamentally do two things. One, to get warfighting capability downrange to the warfighter as cost effectively and efficiently as possible. Secondly, to make sure that we have a healthy, resilient, and secure industrial base that Wall Street and angel investors want to invest in. Everything that I do under this framework falls underneath the three lines of effort of our national defense strategy. First being lethality. We are warfighters. We have many different institutions in our government that we work with in the interagency process that do many other things, but we need to remember we are about lethality. Secondly, we want to strengthen partnerships and alliances. When we go to war, we do not go alone. We go with our allies and partners, and that makes a difference. And thirdly, we are to bring reform to the Department of Defense. It's probably no accident that I was asked to come serve along with Secretary Shanahan, coming from the industrial sector to bring different ideas, having seen DoD from the other side. So with all of that, we are focused on our near-peer competition now, focused primarily on China and Russia, moving away to some degree from countering terrorism. When we look at that great peer competition, what becomes incredibly important is communication. And 5G is going to change the way that we communicate. It will also change our industrial base and how we organize ourselves. So 5G is a national security issue for us, especially because we have to rethink our industry base as we move forward. Economic security is national security, and we need to make sure we have an industrial base that can play. So why is 5G important to us? General Jones gave us some great examples of how much faster it is. I think one way to think about it is that if you wanted to download a high-definition film with 4G, it would take you around 10 minutes. With 5G, there will be less than a millisecond of delay. We're also going to bring peak download speeds to 20 gigabits per second, from 20 gigabits per second to 1 gigabit per second. This initially will be focused on smartphone users and video downloads, but we're thinking about what that means to the warfighter in terms of communicating from land to sea to aircraft, how we interoperate with our foreign allies and partners. So we're not only going to get a quantitative improvement over this communication, it's going to qualitatively change the way we do things. We're looking at how we're actually using the spectrum, moving to millimeter wave, where now we'll have small stations every 200 meters or so in urban areas. We have very directional transmission that could be a help for cybersecurity, or it could be a hindrance. These are the things we're looking at. And in order to frame our thoughts in the department, about 5G, we have asked some of our most trusted partners to work with us to frame what are the questions we should be asking, what are the answers we need to get. So what we typically do is take some great patriots that serve on our Defense Innovation Board, our Defense Science Board, and our Defense Business Board, and we give them hard problems to work on. Last fall, Secretary Mattis asked each three of these boards to look at 5G and advise the department on how to move forward. One of the items that we thought we needed to look at is what are the actual use cases? How will 5G impact us downrange? So our Defense Science Board right now is working with our research and engineering team to come up with use cases on how 5G might be employed. And later this year, we're going to actually go through a whole series of experiments to understand what distances can we communicate over. What is the latency? What is the interference? What do we need to do in order to have the right equipment to bring us capability? We've also asked our Defense Business Board to look at what is our industrial base. Right now, we as the U.S. have critical capability in terms of chips, FPGAs, many of the components that go into 5G. But we don't have the infrastructure today. And we are now depending on like-minded nations, our allies and partners, to do that. That's a new business model for us. What do we need to do to drive the protocols, to drive the standards? How do we effectively make sure that we have a secure network? Do we perhaps look at where we import capability and perhaps put some type of financial penalty on those systems that don't meet our cybersecurity standards? Do we somehow incentivize our industrial base through a series of enticements, if you will, and discouragements for that? We need to understand how to build up to have the capability in the future that's going to let us make decisions at the speed of relevancy. We look at this from the point of view of sensors, of shooters, and all of our platforms engaging together. One of the areas in the building that we have been spending enormous time on in the last 6 months is cybersecurity. And we have to understand how we translate that into new systems. Right now, we have set out an objective of coming up with new cybersecurity standards this year. We'll have metrics by which to measure them. We'll have third parties that can actually audit against them, such as ISO standards we have for quality. We need to then understand how do we put cybersecurity into the new networks we are building? How do we make sure that there aren't back doors there? How do we make sure that data at rest stays secure? We also want to make sure that we come together with like-minded nations to come up with a whole system that we can work and they can use, as we can both work together to develop. So right now, there's quite an intensive dialogue going on to understand where in Europe we might partner. And there has been an enormous amount of discussion about the threat that we see by the Chinese, theft of intellectual property, coming into our networks. And we have to collectively decide how we are technically going to secure our networks, how we legislatively have to have protection. This is an issue that the Department of Defense is standing shoulder to shoulder with the Department of State, Treasury, Commerce, the National Security Council. We are discussing this as a whole of government, and I think you're going to see a huge call to action this year to come together with really what is almost a national industrial policy for 5G. Because the stakes are high. This is going to change how we capitalize our wireless networks. And frankly, with 5G, we're not going to see a difference really between our wired and wireless networks. We as government have to come together, make sure we have the correct standards, make sure we work with allies and partners to ensure that protocols that reflect intellectual property that we understand and that we are driving reflect. So what we're hoping is that industry is going to step up and work with us. One of the things that I've encouraged in my time at DoD is to have what we call listening sessions. We go and throw an issue out, and we bring industry in to give us their ideas to help guide us along. In conjunction with Congress, we are having many, many discussions about how we do this effectively in the 5G world. One of the interesting things about being in government is that I keep drawing analogies to industry, and I look at Congress as a very, very large board of directors. So if you're smart, you go and you use the expertise of that board of directors to help you make good decisions. And right now, there is a high level of interaction between Congress and the Department of Defense to decide how we take the technical opportunities of 5G and translate those into fighting capabilities that are supported by a robust industrial base that includes our allies and partners. So with that, I'm going to come to a conclusion so we have time to have a conversation with Steve, and then we'll open it up for questions to the audience.
Great, thank you. Right there, please. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ellen. So I alluded to the fact that the last time you were here, maybe not at the Atlanta Council, but on this stage, you spoke in the Captains of Industry series. And before coming back round to 5G, I wanted to start with what I hope is a relatively easier question. And that is, you've been the Undersecretary now for more than 18 months. It's a little while. And I'm curious to know, particularly from the backdrop that you had in industry and in engineering, what's either the most surprising, what's a surprising thing either for good or ill? Just take your pick about having this job, being on the other side of the table from which you spent the first 30 years of your career.
I think a huge surprise is the absolute enormity of the task. You sort of know that, but you viscerally sort of live it every day. But the upside is that we have an incredible number of fantastic employees, industry partners, allies, and many, many U.S. patriots, like I was talking about the boards, the Defense Science Board, Innovation Board, Business Board, people who donate their time. But it's surprising how hard it is to get things moving and get them done because it is a large task with a lot of people involved.
For as great as your staff is and as much help as you're getting, it's still a big job.
Yeah.
All right. Let me come around now back to the topic at hand about 5G networks. I want to start with a question that I hope is not too rudimentary, but it reflects some of the feedback I got when we initially put this announcement and invitation out from people, which was along the lines, maybe a little more vernacular than that was put to me. What's the Pentagon got to do with this? If we, the Atlanta Council, had put this topic out and a Commerce Department executive or someone in the commercial telecom regulatory apparatus of the government had been here, they might have found that conventional. But and you talked about it, but I guess I'm asking you to elaborate a little. Why is the Pentagon near the pointy end of our allied engagement and, frankly, the talking points about this issue?
Because 5G, from a technology point of view, is a huge opportunity, but it's a huge threat. If we don't embrace it and apply it towards our goals, we could be overcome quickly with technical overmatch. And we can't allow that to happen. Now, DoD is certainly not going to do this alone. We need to work with all of government. But we have a warfighting imperative. If we cannot communicate as quickly or quicker than our adversaries. If we cannot have situational understanding as to what is happening on the battlefield, then we are going to be in a position where our national security is threatened.
Sticking with this kind of rudimentary starting point, I dare say there may be actually some ordinary people in this audience, let alone watching over the stream. And I think ordinary people think of 4G, 5G, LTE as, where's my device, as this thing. And so they ask themselves, well, I didn't think the Pentagon was transacting either warfighting communications or, for that matter, sensitive communications over these things. Help people understand that whose perspective on 5G is a greater cell phone.
Yeah, great question. So today, we do not fight in isolated areas. Typically, we have what we call a multi-domain interoperable battle, where we have submarines under sea, we have ships on top of the sea, we have land vehicles, dismounted soldiers, aircraft, we're in space. And in order to get relevant situational understanding, we are trading information back and forth all of the time. And what this information has to travel. And it has to travel over a variety of paths with certain protocols. What will happen is, if we do not embrace 5G, and we're just getting going on 4G in a lot of areas, we are going to have a latency or a delay in those conversations that could render everything we have as ineffective. So this has as much to do with communications in bases as it does to huge swarms of unmanned aircraft systems, because more and more we don't have as many large, elegant platforms as we have many, many small platforms that work together in a variety of ways. And what 5G allows us to do is to communicate very quickly. So for instance, 4G, if you look at it, you see how transmitters work as you're moving information, usually have 12 ports, 8 for incoming, 4 for outgoing, something along that line. With 5G, and there's a latency there, you have to wait when your computer downloads. With 5G, you have more like 100 ports, both simultaneously receiving and transmitting, so that you very quickly know what is happening. That is critical for surprise on the battlefield, to understand where we are. So we literally could be left behind if we do not embrace 5G.
Is it are our military forces, and to some degree the Pentagon uses commercial telecom networks, or is it that the technology, you want, American technology to be available, so that when DoD wants to create its own networks, it's working from both world-class standards and world-class capabilities? Because we're not going to buy our military technology and networks from everybody.
Absolutely. We need to be both secure, meaning safe. We also need to be resilient, meaning we are self-healing almost, that we can reconstitute those. We cannot depend on a third party for our communications. So we either have to have trusted partners, or we need to develop our own, but we very much need to understand how those communications are put together, the standards that they're built under, the protocols that are used, and how information is actually moving around. It's really, 5G is what's going to make autonomous cars work, for instance. You have that trusted back and forth very quickly.
Right. You used the term a national industrial policy, and indeed along those lines, I want to quote General Dunford, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was here last week, and it wasn't by any means the main thread of what he had to say, but in response to, I think, General Jones's question about 5G, he said, and it caught my ear and I wrote it down, American industry, General Dunford said, American industry needs to step up and dominate 5G. And I thought, well, that caught my attention. I hadn't appreciated, up to that point in time, and it may only reflect my lack of study of the matter, I had heard the face of this issue as a cybersecurity issue. And then he, and now you, are maybe reminding us and edifying me to the fact that, no, this is an industrial capabilities issue.
There's an offensive portion to this that's critical, and we work very, very closely with our operators downrange to understand what their needs are. We do lots of warfighting games to look at a variety of scenarios to understand what capability is required, and we look at the adversary and where technology could be applied and take them. General Dunford understands as we go through these scenarios that we need 5G capability come 2020 and beyond. He understands that we are only as strong as our industrial base, and he understands right now that there is no U.S. supplier of 5G infrastructure, and he very much hears when industry says, tell us what you need. Tell us what your objectives are. Tell us what your priorities are. And I frankly think we have not done an adequate job of parsing some of the components that go into our warfighting systems to make sure we highlight what critical technologies are really needed. And that's something we've been doing with our National Defense Strategy implementation. You've heard us talk about hypersonics, artificial intelligence. Well, artificial intelligence, if we are going to use machine learning to take big data and process it to understand trends and where we're going, we need 5G. So really what this is I think you see the department, now that we've just dropped our budget and we're really working on how we implement that, we are turning around to industry and saying 5G technology is an imperative. This is a defense ecosystem that is government and industry, and we need industry to work with us. And we work very, very closely, not only with U.S. industry, but with our allies and partners. And that's why we have spent so much time traveling the last 6 months or so to talk to a lot of our allies and partners about this. But we've learned in the building that we need to articulate the 5G imperative a little bit more strongly. To that end, we had a variety of different groups working on different parts of the problem, and we just decided about a month ago that research and engineering, Dr. Lisa Porter, under the Deputy Undersecretary for Research and Engineering, would be our lead within the department to bring all of the 5G efforts together. That being said, in Acquisition and Sustainment, we have the industrial policy responsibility, and we are looking at this as a huge industrial policy issue. In fact, just this morning, we were meeting with 3 of the industry associations, AIA, NDIA, and PSC, to talk about all the different areas in which we are focused to make sure they understand what we need from them and give them the opportunity to talk with us. Because one of our greatest challenges is we don't always make ourselves as available as we could to talk with industry, and that's one of the things I think around 5G, you'll see us doing what I call listening tours, where we go out and get a venue, get the industry associations to sponsor the event, and we throw out what are some of our issues and problems, and then we hope to have industry come and meet with us and give them their ideas as well.
Well, you may have answered the question, and if you already, or you certainly have begun to, but if you could say a little bit more about how does industry respond to this call? Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, step up. The Undersecretary for Acquisition saying, are you asking them to invest more and understand our problem, all of those things? What should there, lots of members of both the commercial industry and the so-called defense industry in this room, what should they go back in their office tomorrow and hear you tell them they need to do?
Okay. I don't think I'm going to tell them what they need to do.
Okay.
I think we need to have a conversation about what is the question we need to answer relative to 5G. What are the problems we're trying to solve? And the question and the problem, I think, are that we as a country right now do not have a clear path forward to develop a 5G architecture and infrastructure. We need to quickly decide how to best do that. And that's not going to be government alone, that's not going to be industry alone. We need to work together, while our adversaries are very, very quickly doing this.
Lean forward at least, and listen, be ready to respond.
Absolutely. I'd say more than that, join the conversation.
Yeah.
Because it's going to take working out how do we prototype and experiment and learn? How do we very, very quickly have that virtuous cycle? That's why we're coming up right now with certain use cases, and we're testing that. We want industry to be involved with that. So I think one of the first listening sessions we'll probably have is rolling out these use cases and asking industry to come and work with us. We know we have the fundamentals, a lot of the chips and the FPGAs here in the US. We need to build up the rest of the system.
Okay. So having talked a little bit about the national industrial policy face of the matter, let me come back to cybersecurity. Should we understand that the salience of 5G for cybersecurity, or how should we understand it? Is it something special about the technology, the ubiquitousness of it? Why are we focused, particularly with our allies, on the cybersecurity aspect of it in any way different than we would focus on conventional telecom or conventional data transfer?
Well, I think we've woken up to the reality that we have huge issues with conventional data transfer as well. And we have learned in the Department of Defense that when you have an enormous amount of even unclassified data exfiltrated and collated together, all of a sudden you have a critical situation where you have a classified matter. The rates, well, when we talk about 5G, everything is going to be moving over it, essentially. And what we need to do is make sure how that information is moving and how you can get at it and how you can keep it secure. I think the best analogy that we've been talking about is if you were building a house, you would want to make sure that the people that built your house, that wired it, that put the locks on the doors, that put in your communications, that they couldn't get back in your house without you knowing about it, and even have ways to get in that you didn't know about it and know everything that was going on. That's where we are with 5G. If we are going to run our entire warfighting ecosystem through communications, which is essentially where we are today. We've got a global battle. We need to make sure that when we send a critical message that others aren't hearing it. We need to be able to test that system. And I think we're turning into really the Internet of Things now. Everything is going to be communicated over 5G in another few years, and we need to understand how to keep critical information secure.
Okay. When you and I first started talking about this, it was a few months ago, and I might be mistaken, but maybe you had recently, I'm turning now to the allies and your engagement with allies. I think you indicated you may recently have been talking to your armaments directors about
Yeah,
this.
absolutely.
And I just wonder if you could share with us, to the extent that you can, what have you been asking them or telling them, and what kind of reception have you received, and who are these people? Just for the benefit of the
So I
audience.
think this was in December when we were talking at the Reagan Defense Forum.
Right.
And just in November, I had been in Brussels at the Council of National Armaments Directors. So NATO nations all have national armaments directors, and we talk a lot about systems that the U.S. is exporting. We do a lot of joint science and technology and work on a variety of problems. And one of the issues that's been particularly resonating over the last 6 months or so is the concern about security and, frankly, the theft of intellectual property by China. And we decided that we were going to have a group to talk about that and how to share best practices in terms of protecting
against that theft of intellectual property. And we in the U.S. have really taken a whole of government approach, working with Treasury on CFIUS, for instance, and most recently on the FIRMA updates to that. We work with State Department on ITAR and a variety of different levers that we have. We work with Commerce on sanctions and different export-import rules and so forth, and we've talked about all of that. But there is an enormous concern about security writ large and cybersecurity particularly because of all the exfiltrations we've seen.
And if you can, what sort of reception did your perspective on the matter receive?
It was kind of, I was shocked because a lot of nations that typically don't work extremely closely with us on this were very receptive, and the next week when we came back, we actually had their embassies reaching out to us, and we've had an ongoing series of bilats as the months have gone by, and a lot of it has come back to 5G and what networks will be instantiated in different countries. And there have been many concerns about what's happened with their 3G and 4G networks, and frankly, a realization that perhaps they need to do things differently moving to 5G.
Within the last couple of weeks, reporting, I don't think there's lots of reporting on this, but there has been some, has suggested that, news reporting, has suggested that our campaign to draw our allies into a like-minded perspective on this issue is, I think the word might have been foundering. Is that your experience or not?
Not on the mill-to-mill level whatsoever, and we continue to work through all different channels, state, commerce, treasury, and so forth. There's actually a huge dialogue going on about what is the path forward and how do we work together, and we've frankly seen a lot of our European allies leaning forward to work with us on that.
Okay. I'm sure there will be other questions from the audience when in about 5 minutes I turn to take questions from the audience about 5G, but I wondered if I could also ask you a couple other things from your stewardship of acquisition and sustainment.
Certainly.
The last of these events that we had here was a conversation with then Deputy Assistant Secretary Eric Tuning, who was here talking about the rollout of the, I think of it as the Executive Order 13806 assessment.
Right, the Defense
industrial
Industrial Base.
Assessment. Exactly. And that came out in November, and at the time, the budget was sort of still pre-decisional at that point, and a lot of the answers that Eric was needed to make were in terms of what we're going to do to remedy some of these shortfalls and vulnerabilities of the industrial base. We're working that through the budget. The budget is now out. Are there places in particular that we should be looking to see that industrial base assessment reflected in policy choices or
well, first
otherwise?
of all, I think that was a nice piece of work because, again, it was an interagency effort, and it really segmented the defense industrial base and gave us a lexicon for talking about it. Pointed
well done.
towards fragilities, pointed towards dependencies on countries for certain items, rare earth metals and so forth. What we will see in the budget is that we're bolstering DPA Title III
Right.
to put some money, IBAS a bit.
For the Defense Production Act, it's the
Yes, I'm
provision
sorry.
of the Defense Production Act
So
that
it's
allows
Congress giving us money to invest in businesses where there isn't a clear business case to get them going. So what we're doing as well, because we know we're only going to get so much money from Congress, we're only going to have so much in our budget for it, we are actually working with investors to identify specific market segments, specific areas where we think investment is needed. Now, we're not going to point towards certain companies, but we can show them investors who is in that area and where we would like to see things bolstered. So where we're getting the Defense Production Act money, we're getting a lot more interest. What we really want to see is basically the free market come in and have us point towards some areas that could use some focus. It's been particularly interesting that we've had a number of wealthy families, what I'll call angel investors, approach us saying that they would be very, very interested in doing things to help our national security and perhaps not make the return on investment they would at other places, but just make somewhat of an investment to help the nation forward. So we do have a whole number of presidential determinations that are coming along that focus on specific areas. The whole team, Scott Baum's here from Industrial Policy. We could talk afterwards about what some of those are that are coming along.
Okay. Thank you. And the other question, apropos of the budget that I wanted to ask before turning to the audience, is something you mentioned at the head of your remarks. There was certainly lethality, a second topic, but the third one was reform.
Correct.
And I happen to notice, being the old programmer that I am, that there is about an $8 billion, what I'd call negative wedge. That is to say, a plan to save money in the program that you all have probably already committed to other programs. Again, I may not have read as carefully as some others have at this point what the content of that reform is, but I suspect some of that has been allocated to the Undersecretary for Acquisition to work over.
So we are saying, you were asking, how are we saving money through reform?
Yeah, exactly.
So,
exactly. There's a lot of money that needs to be saved in order to protect the program.
Absolutely.
What are we doing?
Under my purview, probably the biggest area of opportunity is with the Defense Logistics Agency. And what we're doing there is what we call category management, where we are looking at certain buys of something, say medical equipment, and we are aggregating those buys so that we get the economy of scale for larger purchases, fewer purchase requisitions, and then doing things like drop shipping to the point of use. We're looking at actually working with the VA a little bit on that as well. So the idea being, take a look at what you're buying, where the volume is, how you can aggregate those buys and get savings out of it. That's a big part of it. We also are looking across warehousing, how we do that, how we can do it more efficiently, get rid of it. We are looking at buys that the services do themselves right now, where we could save money if we brought that in. But anywhere where we have scale is usually the biggest area of opportunity. So for us, the Defense Logistics Agency is one of our greatest money-saving targets right now.
Okay, thank you. All right, I would, if you could turn the house lights up so that it's easier for us to see you, starting with me. I will take questions from the audience, and I'm going to start with this gentleman on the fourth row, and then I will come to the gentleman on the third row over there. Please identify yourself. Stand up if you would. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Noah Barkin. I'm a journalist based in Berlin, currently doing a fellowship at AICGS here in Washington on this issue. I'm curious, I'm based in Berlin, in Germany right now, also in Britain. There seems to be a sense that the governments can mitigate the security risks without pursuing an outright ban of Huawei. I'm curious for your views on that, and also following up on...
Remember, one question.
Okay, my view. That is a huge concern to us right now. And I think we're on record saying that if our allies and partners go with a Huawei solution, we need to reconsider how we share critical information with them, because we're not, we want to make sure that that's secure information.
I'm sorry.
I was going to say, we continue to talk to the UK as well as Germany on an ongoing basis about this very thing.
Let me see hands again before we take this gentleman's question. All right, when this gentleman is done, we'll give the microphone to the gentleman in front of him. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Gary Reimer. I happen to be a blessed DoD contractor, blessed because I love it. Recognizing that 5G has the bandwidth to allow for much stronger encryption because of the amount of data that you can move forward and the risks of supply chain risk management if by not manufacturing the chips onshore for every part of it, for at least national security systems, what steps are we taking? We're not in class setting clearly, but what steps are we taking to bring manufacturing onshore and make sure that encryption is built in as a basement level of the protocol?
So we have a lot of chips produced onshore right now, and what we are contemplating from an industrial strategy point of view is whether or not we want to broaden what we'd call our trusted network of production. So there are ongoing discussions about what that would look like, what the most critical elements of the supply chain are, and what companies are set up right now. Because although this is critical to us for military utilization, there are many industries out there that have the same level of concern. You think about banks, a lot of other variety of businesses. So an ongoing discussion right now as to where to start, how to do that, how it financially makes sense.
Actually, that stand by, and then we'll get to this gentleman. Reminds me, I guess among the things that I'm trying to come to learn is that cybersecurity is one part technical, one part maybe software, one part hardware, one part software. Are there a particular, and again, I guess I anyway, let's say normal people, may not think of the 5G problem as a software problem, but are there software dimensions to it, which again, our industry ought to be attending?
Absolutely. There is a lot of code associated with this, and how secure that code is critical to us. One of the things that we're doing right now is looking at how we develop code in a very secure environment so that it's not compromised as we go along. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the innovation at DoD comes from small companies, and often when we go to small companies and try to make sure they're cyber hardened, we can either put them out of business because it costs so much, or have them deselect from doing business with us. So one of the things we're doing is coming up with some Pathfinder projects to create something we call DevSecOps, where we have an enclave in a cloud where we put our hardened containers and we have people go in and use it to develop their software. If they use our stack, they automatically get an authority to operate. This is the type of GFEing, government furnished equipment, mm-hmm. that we would like to put out there so that we understand the code and make sure it's not compromised.
So this the 5G issue is not discrete. It's not a discrete technical cyber issue. It's a system problem.
Exactly.
It's
an architecture.
It's just as big as a big problem
with hardware and software.
Yeah. Okay. We're going to take this gentleman's question and then a question from that gentleman who's on the outside of about the 6th row, right there.
Steve Winters, independent consultant. So, as I understand it, right now there's Huawei and Ericsson are the two providers of 5G, and certain European countries have now decided that they'll go with Ericsson, even though Huawei offers them a less expensive solution. So my question is, if I understand you, then there'll be an American third sort of 5G product, which we totally produce. That's the good part. But from the standpoint of what it's going to cost, do you really think that this American product, if it is going to be competitive in any other part of the world with Huawei, or for that matter, Ericsson? And then how can you convince the industry people to produce it if they're not really going to be able to commercialize it?
I'm not sure we're going to have a total U.S. solution. We are talking to Ericsson, we are talking to Nokia quite a bit, but it comes down to what is the overall value proposition you have. What are you saving today that you're mortgaging the future with, so to speak? So that's part of the question we're trying to answer, is how do you come up with a value proposition that works in the long run?
Is the particular advantage, or putative anyway, advantage that Huawei has today, is it cost only, or is it also technical capability, intellectual property?
Right now, Huawei has very good capability at a good cost. Our issue is the security associated with that and what you're trading off.
But if if our industry, or at least the resources on which our country and not least our Department of Defense can rely, is going to catch up, I'm just trying to narrow down whether it's we just need scale and cost, or whether we also have to figure some things out
I
technically
think
and
we
otherwise.
need innovation, infrastructure. We've got to figure some things out and figure how to build them. We can do it. We have quite a bit of the intellectual property around it, but we haven't figured it all out yet. And part of figuring it out is working with the standards bodies for what the standards and the protocols will be. So there are a lot of different dimensions to this issue.
Okay. There's a question there, and then there's a woman on the very back row whose question we will take.
Thanks. Justin Doubleday with Inside Defense.
We can't quite hear you yet. Stand by.
Hello?
Again, please.
Got me?
Thank you.
Hey, Justin Doubleday with Inside Defense. I just wanted to ask, can you point to any areas in DoD's budget requests where you're kind of pushing investments toward 5G infrastructure, devices, and the standards that you're trying to get after?
There is no one key pool of money. I think what you will see throughout research and engineering, as well as the services, there are multiple line items that talk about this. Probably the key money this year will be in a lot of the experiments that are done in the R&E side, but there is no one key line. That may well change next year.
Could you repeat the name of the official in R&E who has been anointed with responsibility for this?
Dr. Lisa Porter.
Okay. All right, very good. There's a question on the back row, and then we're going to take a question on the third row by the aisle on the left, on my left. Please.
Hi, my name is Lindsay Gorman. I'm with the German Marshall Fund, the new Emerging Technologies Fellow, and I work with our colleagues in Germany on the question of Huawei and 5G in Europe. And I was very encouraged. First of all, thank you for this event. It's certainly a timely question in Europe, and I was encouraged to hear that the military-to-military discussions are going very well. My question is whether you can comment on how this campaign is faring in terms of providing robust and fact-based cyber risk assessments to some of these alternative kind of halfway proposals to excluding Huawei from European 5G networks, such as that Germany and the UK are banding about and debating. Thank you.
I think the question about how you actually quantify the risk and how you describe the challenges is a very, very good one. We actually share a lot of intelligence with our allies and partners, giving specific examples of compromises. And I think one can extrapolate the harm which that can do. So I think part of our challenge here is how you take that information you have in the classified world and somehow translate it to the unclassified world to have people understand the impact of what this means to be compromised. And frankly, that's where we can work together, government can work together with industry to come up with some good examples of that and some what-if solutions. I don't think that we have developed the information, if you will, that's readily absorbed by the average individual to understand the threat and the imperative and the consequences.
Yeah, so some of the reporting to which I've already alluded indicates that there are European voices that are saying, in so many words, the U.S., the United States doesn't have the goods on this. They haven't made the case. And I'm hearing you say, and I just want to confirm if I'm hearing you correctly, they may not have all the intelligence, and maybe we have not packaged the risk assessment in a way that that more people could understand and appreciate?
We can do a better job of talking about the risks. I think we can also, focusing on the offense, as I would like to do here, focus more on the path forward and how do we collectively come up with a solution. And that's what we're trying to do at DoD. I think that's why you hear General Dunford talking about this a bit, why he's very aware of it. Every single, I think, office at DoD is concerned about how we collectively take our resources and focus in the short term on this issue, because time is not on our side here.
Let me actually borrow on that question to ring out another issue that I hear, at least being reported, are some of the perspectives of those in Europe who are resisting our call to action. And it is the suspicion that American officials are promoting a national, and I dare say even a commercial industrial interest under the guise of a security issue. How would you respond to that?
I tend to be very data-driven, and I'm always asking for the data behind something, so I would ask for the data that supports that conclusion. Right now, we're trying to come up with a solution that is affordable and technically viable and uses trusted sources. We're not all the way there yet, and that's what we need to do. But this is no gimmick. This is the real deal.
Moreover, and please correct me if I'm not hearing this correctly, although I have attributed the term national industrial policy to this, I think I've heard you say we're really looking for an international industrial collaboration with our European Nokia, Ericsson, and other European partners, as well as American industry. Is that right?
We have a national imperative. We always work with our allies and partners and would like to leverage them as much as possible. So international support could be part of our national solution that then becomes an international solution as well, which would be the best case.
Great. We have just 4 minutes left. We probably have time for 2 questions, and one of them is going to come right here, and the other one is going to come from this gentleman right on the second row here.
Good evening. My name is Jose Antonio Lopez from Hispanic Association on Corporate Responsibility. You already informed us about European countries working on 5G, but are you considering having Latin American countries working with the U.S. and about 5G?
Absolutely. Tomorrow we have a bilat with Brazil. We are talking with our partners around the world, and I think anyone who wants to join in on the conversation is more than welcome.
Sir?
Ms. Lord, I'm Tony Melita. I'm the Executive Director of the National Spectrum Consortium. We have another transaction with Dr. Porter's organization, and we were created about almost 4 years ago to deal with the sell-off of military aspects of the electromagnetic spectrum. We are very interested in dealing with this issue. We've been studying the President's memo that's gone to all the federal executive branch agencies. We have written all those agencies, trying to be that go-to entity for U.S. industry and academia. So the National Spectrum Consortium is over 220 companies, about 70% non-traditionals, companies like Nokia. The issue that we have, and I think it gets to your question or comment associated with the path forward and asking industry to step up. Individual companies are doing whatever they think is necessary. How do we do this as a national industrial base? Again, with an industry organization like NSC wanting to step up for that, but we've got to get that demand signal. We've got to get that coordination from the various federal agencies to help move us and use the NSC as that mechanism for engaging U.S. industry and academia.
That's really very, very good to hear. I found that industry associations are the most effective and efficient way for DoD to work with industry. And what we will do is we will certainly reach out to you as we go through the use cases we're looking at and go through our deliberations, because that's exactly what we need. So thank you.
Well, I'm going to give you the last word, but before I do, I want to thank you very, very much for coming here again. This is as others have said, a topical issue and one that very much belongs in a conversation about defense industrial policy. I want to thank General Jones. I want to thank the whole audience, both here and online. Do you have a capstone that you'd like to lay
Well,
on
first
us?
of all, I'd like to say thank you for the forum and thank you for getting the conversation going.
You're welcome.
Because it's absolutely critical to have this conversation, be focused on the objective, really determine a path and start executing. So please keep in touch with the department. We'll be doing more and more of that. From an acquisition and sustainment point of view, I think the first stop should be our industrial policy shop. So thank you very much.
Thank you.